Alright, hi everyone. I hope you're having a great day. So this is lecture video 7. The major topic for today is going to be standardized testing. So when we're thinking about standardized testing, this is a subject that people often have very strong opinions on. And you'll see that activity 6 is going to ask you to discuss your thoughts on standardized testing. Please try to limit the number of curse words you use, but that's a joke. But in reality, standardized testing was created with a good purpose in mind, and so we need to think about where perhaps we've deviated from that purpose and how we could maybe fix things or change things that could then still have that same result that we were looking for. So we'll talk about the purpose of standardized testing in this video, and then in the next video we'll talk a little bit more about how to make sure that our standardized tests are of high quality. So let me know if you have any questions. Let's go ahead and get started. Alright, as I said, today we're going to start off by talking about children who are gifted. So when we're talking about learners who are exceptional, basically what we're saying is a learner that is different from the typical or the average learner, if such a thing even exists. So during our last video, we focused on learners who might have extra challenges to overcome. Today we're going to be talking about learners who are gifted. So we'll talk a little bit about what this could look like. We'll talk a little bit about where this comes from, and we'll have a few suggestions about how to educate children who are gifted. So first of all, briefly, characteristics of gifted children. Now, one thing you should know is that when you're talking about a large group of individuals, it's very difficult to narrow down specific criteria of exactly what this looks like. One child that is gifted may look very different from another child who is gifted. But children who are gifted, first of all, tend to be precocious. And what we mean by that is that they are often a little bit ahead in several different areas. So they might be physically ahead. They might meet their physical milestones a little bit earlier. So there's a range of what is considered normal or expected when it comes to things like walking or things like talking. And what you might see is that children who are gifted might, from a very early age, meet those milestones a little bit earlier. In addition to that, they tend to learn a little bit differently from other students. That's what it's getting at here, talking about they march to their own drummer. Basically, students who are gifted may need a different approach from a teacher. So for students who are gifted, they may already be kind of internally motivated. And so it may not be as much a situation where the teacher has to be the cheerleader to get the student to do their work. It's more like the teacher is the person who is further along in this learning process, the advanced learner that's sharing information with this individual and kind of guiding them to continue to challenge them. So children who are gifted, maybe one of the most difficult things might be giving them an appropriate level of challenge. Now, I said in the last video that there are certain teaching techniques that work for all students. Things like reinforcing good behavior and learning, encouragement, maybe having students move around in the classroom. But in addition to that, it is also helpful for all children to be in their zone of proximal development. Now, I know that we talked about this previously, but just as a reminder, the idea of a zone of proximal development is that there are certain tasks that are so easy that you can do those without help. And there is some benefit to staying there for a little while to build fluency, to be able to do these things quickly and accurately. However, if we stay there too long, then children will get bored. They won't be challenged. On the other hand, there will be some tasks that are too difficult for them to complete even with a helper. And so trying to complete those would just be frustrating for everyone involved. But rather, in between those, we have a zone of proximal development, a sweet spot. And this is true for all children. So all children, regardless of what they are considered a typical learner or maybe a learner who has extra struggles or a learner who is gifted, they are all going to benefit from being kept in that zone of proximal development, from being appropriately challenged. But you may find that challenging students who are gifted in the classroom may be a struggle for a teacher who is already working with different zones of proximal development, and other children. It may be hard for you to find time and opportunity to provide additional challenges for gifted students. In addition, these students tend to have a passion for mastery So as I said, they may be more internally motivated. Now, this is a good thing. We want students to be internally motivated. We want students to be on their own, capable of starting things, being independent. We want that. However, you also have to bear in mind that gifted children might have some downsides to being gifted. It might be difficult at times. So a student that is gifted that has very high expectations for themselves, or perhaps they feel the high expectations of parents, teachers, and others, might start to feel anxiety, might start to feel a lot of pressure associated with that. And so that's something to keep in mind. OCD-like perfectionistic qualities here can cause emotional distress in children who are gifted. So while we do want to encourage students having a passion for mastery, we also want to be careful not to push them too hard or to let them push themselves too hard. Now, we ask the question, where does giftedness come from? Because as a parent and as an educator, we want to try to understand what it means to be gifted. So in many different areas of psychology, we have this nature versus nurture discussion. This is never going to go away, but specifically talking about giftedness, the question is a child born gifted, or does a child become gifted because of something in the environment? Now, one thing to mention here is, although we did just talk about some characteristics of giftedness, we don't have a specific definition here. We're saying that giftedness involves some kind of advanced ability in some particular area, but there are many different areas in which an individual could be gifted. So thinking back to our last lecture video when we talked about the different potential types of intelligence, about how a person could be gifted in a musical way, or could be gifted in a bodily kinesthetic way, or in a verbal way. So there's certainly many different arenas in which a person could be gifted. When we're asking ourselves the question, what makes a person gifted? Oftentimes with the nature-nurture question, the answer is both, and I would say that usually that is the case. With an individual who has some kind of special ability here, and by special ability, I mean, giftedness. I'm not talking Spider-Man here, but giftedness, the individual probably did receive a genetic predisposition. It may be that parents also were gifted in a particular area. If you think about, for example, a bodily kinesthetic kind of giftedness, there are certain physical characteristics that set a person up to be more likely to be successful. So not everyone has the body type to be a professional basketball player or to be a gymnast or whatever sport you're thinking about. So certainly there are genetic aspects of certain things that you can receive that maybe make it a little bit easier for you. But if we're talking about maybe a traditional giftedness in a classroom setting, it is possible that having parents with a higher level of intelligence then makes a child more likely to be born with a higher level of intelligence. But on the other hand, it's not necessarily just genetics. There is also a nurture side of things as well, that practice makes perfect. And so you'll very rarely find someone gifted in an area that they spend very little time in. So the person might have been born with a genetic predisposition towards playing an instrument, for example, but unless they practice with that instrument, then we'll never know that they had that hidden talent. So it's probably a combination of both nature and nurture. One of the things that we look at to try to help us understand this question is the age at which they start showing signs of being gifted. If a child starts showing signs of being gifted very early on, before they've had any kind of formal training, then that points to nature. A child that just naturally picks up on language, naturally picks up on math skills, even though no one has worked with them, suggests it's probably not the environment, it's probably something genetic. But on the other hand, we do see that most gifted children are gifted in certain areas, but not gifted in all areas. And the fact that they're gifted in certain specific areas may be because they have practiced this well-established domain. Maybe they were born with a predisposition to be good at it, but they had parents that provided opportunities and that encouraged it, and the children had the internal motivation to follow through. So certainly there's a combination of both nature and nurture at play when it comes to giftedness. Now, if you're talking about educating children who are gifted, the first thing you have to do is to try to identify which students would qualify as gifted. In a school setting, there are several different ways that this can be done. We are going to start talking about standardized testing today. So standardized testing could be one way. In the school that I went to, we did not have a gifted program. It was a small school, but my husband's high school had a gifted program, and he was involved in the gifted program from a young age, maybe even in elementary school. And according to him, the way that he was selected for a gifted program involved standardized testing, intelligence testing, that kind of thing. So oftentimes children may be chosen because of a particular score on a particular test. And certainly it makes sense to do it that way, because when you use standardized testing, there is maybe a firm cutoff of who it does and who does not qualify, and so it's not as subjective, it's not as biased. But on the other hand, there are also other things to keep in mind as well. It's not just about how a person performs on one particular test on one particular day. We would expect to see students who are gifted would also have signs of that in the home and in their classroom and maybe in other educational settings. So how do we educate children who are gifted? Well, there may be some resources that you have available. It depends on the school system you're in, what options you have, basically how much money your school system has. Children who are gifted may benefit from special classes. This could be, like for example, advanced placement classes or classes in special hands-on areas. So it talks down here about work study or community service programs. There may be opportunities for students to do something during the school time, maybe even off of the school campus, maybe even taking college classes if you live close to a college, or maybe doing some kind of mentorship, apprenticeship program, a job, that kind of thing. If those things are available, then that's great, as long as the student is enjoying it and as long as it's not putting undue pressure on the student. But then also, in addition to that, there are things you can do to try to enrich the regular classroom setting. So you may find yourself in a situation where you would love to have a student doing special classes or a student doing an apprenticeship, but that may not be an option for you. So thinking about ways to try to challenge gifted students in the classroom, sometimes the way this ends up working out is that the students who are more gifted or the students who are more ahead end up serving as tutors to the students who are a little bit more behind. Of course, this is a controversial subject. On the one hand, I do think that you learn material better and you retain it longer if you teach it to another person. That's actually always one of my study tips when you're studying for a test. Don't just read the material, go out, find someone else and teach it to them. And if they'll listen, maybe buy them a pizza and some beer. But if they'll listen to you talk about the subject, teaching it to someone else is a great way for you to understand how well you know it. So on the one hand, I absolutely understand that. On the other hand, there is some concern that, first of all, we're creating kind of a classroom hierarchy here. And this is going to come up in a slide in a second, when we separate students by their ability levels, and then that we can have a self-fulfilling prophecy here. But then also, it may be a situation where the student would actually benefit more from having additional work, from having additional projects, especially if it's something where the student is interested in doing that. So I would say you would want to talk to the parents, talk to the student, talk to principals, other teachers, and get feedback before you decide what's the most appropriate course here. One of the most important things you can do is to make sure that school is a positive experience for students who are gifted. We would expect that students who are gifted would probably like school because they're good at it and it's an area in which they can be successful. However, there are plenty of things that can happen that can make school a negative experience for gifted students. So first of all, students may be bullied or just thought of as being different from their classmates because they make better grades or because they're given extra work, that kind of thing. So trying to reduce that as much as possible. But then also making sure that school is not boring. So what you'll find oftentimes, especially in younger students, is that the student who already knows the material and is already done with their work may get into trouble. Maybe a student who's so bored that they come across as ADHD, they don't seem to be paying attention, or maybe they're actually getting into trouble and you're having to punish them in the classroom because the student is bored. So guiding the student to new challenges as much as possible is really helpful. Remember that giftedness is usually domain specific, so we should not expect, it would not be fair to expect a student who is gifted in math to necessarily be gifted in every other area as well. We should remember that we all have a range of abilities when it comes to different skills, and that not all of us are, exactly equal across the board. Oftentimes we have strengths and weaknesses, and that's okay. Remembering to build on the individual's strengths, but then also to try to shore up their weaknesses as well. Monitoring and evaluating readiness for accelerated learning. When you take a student out of a regular classroom and give them special classes, for example, or even if you leave the student in the classroom and just give them additional responsibilities or additional work, we want to do that so that it's a positive experience. What we don't want to do is provide stress and anxiety. So keeping in touch with the child, tracking the child's progress to make sure that they're not becoming overly stressed or overly anxious, to make sure this is not a situation where perfectionism might actually be reducing the quality of their work and reducing their school experience, trying to make sure that they are actually ready. The last thing we want to do is to take a child out of a setting in which they're thriving and then put them into a more challenging setting that they weren't ready for. So keeping an eye on that. And then involving the parents. I feel like parents should be more involved in every aspect of education, but when it comes to students that are gifted, you want to provide as much as you can as far as the school system is concerned. But if you're doing everything that you can and you don't think the student is getting enough challenges, then talking to the parents, maybe there's something outside of school, after school, that can be done that would be really great for the student. So I already touched on this a little bit. Should teachers group students in the classroom based on their learning abilities? So what we're saying here is that within a regular classroom setting, we have students who are a little bit behind doing certain tasks. We have students who are in our typical expected range doing certain tasks. And we have students who are a little bit ahead doing certain tasks, or maybe having the students who are ahead working with the students who are behind, that kind of thing. So we're basically creating groups within a particular classroom. I don't have all the answers here, and this is certainly a difficult subject, partly because I can see both sides. On the one hand, you want to individualize education. So if you try to give everyone the same assignments, the same instructions, the same opportunities in the interest of fairness, you might also actually not be fair to the students, because what works for one student might not work for another student. And so giving a student work that is too easy or that is too hard is not in their zone of proximal development. So I do understand trying to provide assignments that are appropriate based on a student's ability level and helping the student be successful with what they're doing at the moment. But of course, the challenge here is that when you do that, as I said, you can create this self-fulfilling prophecy. It won't take long for students to start to figure out that that particular table of students is doing different work from us and start comparing themselves. Are they doing work that's harder? Are they doing work that's easier? And children may use this as an opportunity to kind of form cliques and to bully and that kind of thing. And so the last thing we want to do here is to set up this expectation for a student. You're a student who's behind, you're a student who's typical, you're the student who's ahead, and then put them in categories that they feel like they can't break out of. I mean, even the student that's gifted, having a student that's gifted, knowing they're gifted is great, and it's encouraging for them to know that, but at the same time, that student might start to feel pressure. That student might start to feel like it's not fair. If one student is given an assignment that's easier, and one student is given an assignment that's harder, at the end of the day, there may be some debate over that, over whether that's fair or not. So what I would say here is that if you're going to use this, it has to be used very thoughtfully and not used all the time. I certainly wouldn't always keep students. And if you're going to group students, then maybe group them this way on certain tasks, and then have mixed groups at other times. All right. So that is the material on giftedness. We are also going to briefly start talking about standardized tests today. As I said in the introduction, I do know that standardized testing is something that we all have different experiences with and we all have different emotional reactions to. And I'm going to try to be sensitive to that today. What we're going to primarily talk about during this lecture is the standardized test purposes. And then during the next lecture, we'll talk a little bit about how to evaluate our standardized tests and make sure that they are valid, make sure they're reliable, make sure that they are doing what they're supposed to be doing. But first of all, what do I mean when I say a standardized test? Well, I touched on this a little bit when we're talking about intelligence testing, because intelligence testing is an example of a standardized test. But a standardized test means that this is a particular assessment that has uniform procedures for administration and scoring. So you have to be trained to administer these. Now, depending on which test it is and how complicated it is, you might need more training than others. So when I was in graduate school, we were trained on a variety of intelligence tests, achievement tests, personality tests, these kinds of things. Trained on how to properly administer them, how to score them, and then also how to interpret those scores, write a report on that. But as a teacher, you may be asked to administer standardized tests, or at the very least to look over the results of standardized testing and maybe meet with parents and answer questions, that kind of thing. So it is important for you to be familiar with the specific tests that are being used. Now, the idea here is that if we have the same administration, the same scoring, the same interpretation for all students, that this makes it fair. This allows for comparisons by age, grade level, and local and national norms. Now, I do understand that a lot of people have a negative reaction to standardized testing, but let's think about what would happen if we didn't have standardized testing at all. So if each school district was just doing what each school district wanted to do and there was no way to measure their progress, then we really wouldn't know what works and what doesn't work. We really wouldn't know how different school districts were comparing to other school districts, how different states were comparing to other states, or how different countries compared to other countries. So there is certainly a good intention here of allowing us to have a standardized administration where everyone gets the same questions, standardized scoring so that there's no bias, theoretically, and then standardized interpretation of exactly what those tests mean across area. And when it talks about by age and grade level, this gives us an idea of, are we where we're supposed to be for our particular age? If we didn't have standardized tests, then I wouldn't really know what is a fourth grader supposed to look like. What is a fourth grade math ability or fourth grade reading ability? I wouldn't know that. The information we have, however limited it may be and far from perfect, comes from standardized tests. So, what I want you guys to do for your Activity 6 is to tell me about your thoughts about standardized testing. So I'm going to ask this in a couple of different ways. First of all, I ask you to think about this from the perspective of an elected official. So imagine that you were an elected official, whether that be in local government or state government, federal government. Imagine that you were the person who was in charge of making decisions about standardized testing. What would you do? Try not to go too far with the power trip here thinking about this, but you might say, I would get rid of it altogether. And if you say that, I understand. If you say that, please try to explain why you would do that and how you would replace it with something else. Or you might say, I would keep it, but these are some changes that I would make. Or I like it the way it is, and this is why I like it the way it is. But just for some things to get you started thinking, what would you do with students who had poor test scores? Would you get them into special programs? Would you hold them back based on their grade, make them repeat a grade? What would you do with schools that consistently had low test scores? So if there was a school district that was continuing to score below average, what are some things that you could do with that information to actually to benefit the school systems? So, and then I think when you actually do the activity in Canvas, I think it also says, how do you feel about standardized testing? So feel free to sprinkle that in, although I'll probably get that from your responses to the other questions. Basically, I'm asking you to think about how you would change things if you were the person who was determining the way standardized testing was used. And really what I'm thinking about here is standardized testing in a public school system. Certainly this is not the only place where we see standardized testing, but this is oftentimes where the debate goes on. All right. Now, I understand that standardized testing is far from perfect, and certainly there are things that could be done to improve them. The purposes of standardized testing, there are several, and they were certainly created with good intentions in mind. But first of all, it helps diagnose students' strengths and weaknesses. So when you give a student a standardized test, you give a student an achievement test, for example, you get some feedback on how that student is doing. There may be certain areas where a student is excelling, and we may not have known that. And so now, because of that, we know that the student might need additional challenges, or the student might need to be in gifted classes, that kind of thing. But it may also be a situation where a student's been struggling, and we haven't realized that the student's been struggling, maybe only in a particular area, and we recognize that, and then because of that, we can get the student the extra help that he or she needs. So it's intended to diagnose strengths and weaknesses, also to provide information for planning and instruction. So as a teacher, you would want to know where your students were with certain skills. So for example, if you're going to be teaching third grade, you want to know at the beginning of third grade, okay, are these students average readers? Are they above average? Are they below average? Where are they? So that you know where to start. If you have a different group of students every year, then it's hard for you perhaps to measure at the beginning of the year how well are they doing. It may take months for you to figure out that there's a problem there that you didn't see before just because these are brand new students for you. So providing information to the teacher about what level of tutoring needs to be involved. Also, it provides information about progress and program placement. If we did not have standardized tests, how would we determine who ended up in gifted? How would we determine who ended up in special education? I think the fear is that our standardized tests are intended to be an unbiased measure. Everybody gets the same questions, everybody gets the same scoring, and if we got rid of standardized testing, then how would we determine who gets to be in gifted, who gets to be in special education, so on and so forth? Perhaps this plays a role in, for example, who gets scholarships. So things like the ACT. The ACT is also an example of a standardized test where everyone receives the same questions, the same administration, the same scoring, and then it compares you with your same age peers. That provides colleges with information about scholarships. So although standardized testing certainly has its faults, it does give us information, and we need that information. In addition, it can help to contribute to accountability. So, as I said, without standardized testing, we might not be aware that there's a problem. Sometimes grades alone are not enough because different school districts, different teachers, different classrooms might have different grading settings. So just because you can look at a grade book and say, okay, well, these are the number of students who had A's, these are the students who had B's, you don't really know exactly what an A means. In one particular classroom, what it took to get an A here might have gotten you a C in a different classroom. And so because it's not standardized, it's hard to hold school districts accountability, or hold them accountable, to have accountability, I should say, if we didn't have standardized testing to allow us to have the same questions for everyone. And then it can help in program evaluation. We might administer a reading test, for example, and then try out a new reading program, and then after that administer that test again to see if that reading program was effective. We could do an experiment here where certain students received the old reading instruction, certain students received the new reading instruction, and compare them. So it would be really hard to see how well our programs were working and whether we should continue to put money into them if we didn't have standardized testing. So the thing about standardized testing that I think is most controversial refers to high-stakes testing. So first of all, a standards-based test is having students take a test, a standardized test, and comparing them with a certain standard. This is what is expected, maybe based on your age or based on your grade level, compared to your other same age peers. So a standards-based test is just a test that is standardized where you're going to be compared to a certain standard that is in place. Are you ahead of the standard? Are you behind the standard? Are you right where the standard expects you to be? Now, the thing that makes this controversial is the high stakes aspect, I think, because the high stakes aspect says we're going to use these tests in ways that will have important consequences for the student. It is possible that we could administer standards-based tests without it being high-stakes testing. We could administer the tests, and then based on that, we could make some adjustments at the grade level, make some adjustments at the school district level, without saying, well, because of this particular score, you're not going to graduate, you're going to get held back, you're not going to be in gifted, that kind of thing. So we could administer the standards-based test and just use those results to inform us without making particular decisions for a particular student based on that score. On the other hand, though, high-stakes testing is pretty common, where important decisions are made, maybe not just for the school or for the district, but for the student based on the results of that test. And so this is usually where students have issue with standardized testing because of things like anxiety. So knowing that the results of a particular test are going to be really influential in your life, that's very stressful. And towards the end of this set of slides, we'll talk a little bit about ways to try as a teacher to try to help students be comfortable when it comes to standardized testing. And ways to try to improve that experience for students. We all know, though, that it is stressful. I remember taking the ACT. I remember taking the GRE, which is the grad school version of the ACT. And I do know how stressful that is. Having said that, though, and certainly that is an issue and a concern, but one potential answer to that question is that pretty much all the students taking the test are going to be anxious. So if we have a test that's going to make some kind of important decision, like for example the ACT, when high school students go to take the ACT, you know that important decisions are going to be made based on the results of that ACT. So because of that, everyone has similar, I'm not going to say the same, but everyone has kind of similar stake in the outcome. So it would make sense that the vast majority of people taking those tests would be struggling with anxiety. And in those situations, then the anxiety kind of becomes part of the standardization. Everybody's getting the same questions, everybody's getting the same scoring, everybody's having the same freak out at the same time. Now, I do understand that's not true because for some students, the anxiety is more of a problem than others. Some students will care more about the outcomes than the others. And so there are things we're going to talk about in the next lecture video that can help put students at ease a little bit when it comes to standardized testing. But one of the arguments for high stakes testing is that in addition to holding schools accountable, which standards-based tests could do, we do also want to hold students accountable as well. The idea that if we did away with standardized testing, then students might not feel like it was as important for them to be engaged in their education. So maybe students, if they realize that they can get good grades in the class without putting in as much effort, without standardized testing there to hold them accountable, may not put in that effort. So I would say this is a complicated issue that certainly has its benefits as well as its drawbacks. And so because of that, I always look forward to reading your responses, hearing what you guys have to say about standardized testing. So that is actually where I'm going to leave off lecture for today. During our next lecture video, we're going to be finishing up our standardized testing slides. We're going to have a conversation about how to make sure that our standardized tests are valid and reliable, and how to make sure that these tests are administered in the best way possible. So we'll talk more about that next time. Don't forget about Activity 6, which is your opportunity to tell me how you feel about standardized testing. Also, be thinking ahead and preparing for Exam 2 and just letting me know if you have any questions. So let me know if you need anything. Otherwise, I will talk to you guys in the next lecture video.